Alright lads, welcome to another one of my War Thunder vehicle reviews. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Type 74G. This is the highest level premium currently available for the Japanese territory. It's a rank 6 battle rating 9.0 medium tank, obviously located in the Japanese territory. Now, with the Japanese territory being pretty sparse, especially at top tier, there are questions as to whether you should even grind the Japanese nation past, say, 6.3. While Japan does have one or two top tier tanks that are very impressive, mainly the Type 10, from 6.7 up to around 9.0, it's largely a struggle fest. So we're not off to a great start on whether you should actually buy this tank. But maybe I'm being a little bit unfair, but I just want to make it clear, grinding out the Japanese territory isn't the most fun experience, and the Japanese nation currently isn't really in the meta. So just consider that before you go out and spend your money. But for anybody that's still on this video watching, if you want to find out whether this is a good premium to buy, well stick around for the rest of the video. Anyway, boys and girls, mainly boys though if you looked at my viewer stats. Anyway, let's not waste any time. Let's jump straight into the mobility and the survivability. This tank is powered by an engine producing 720 horsepower. When combined with the vehicle's weight of 37.3 tons, it gives you a rather disappointing power to weight ratio of 19.3 horsepower per ton. This is one of the biggest criticisms of the Type 74G. It's very slow in comparison to some of the other battle rating 9.0 premiums, especially compared to the XM1, albeit that is a battle rating 9.3, but you basically have the same matchmaking. While the vehicle's top speed of 54 km per hour going forwards and 17 km per hour in reverse don't sound too bad, that low power to weight ratio means it takes absolute ages for you to get up to those top speeds. This is very bad in War Thunder, but the meta is so fast paced at the minute, it basically just limits your ability to react on the battlefield. If you move away from a cap circle and then an enemy enters it again, it's very hard for you to get back to that cap to prevent them from capping. So, the mobility of this tank is pretty poor, but what about the survivability? Well, it has a crew of 4, like most of the other NATO vehicles. Japan isn't in NATO, but it did take quite a lot of influence from American designs. So the 4-man crew does give it pretty decent survivability, at least compared to some of the Soviet vehicles. It's unlikely for all 4 crew members to be knocked out in a single penetrating hit. However, if you are up tier to 9.7, which is pretty common, the powerful APFSTS rounds which you can encounter are likely to one-shot you, as they do produce more shrapnel. Anyway, this tank does not feature any advanced type of armour, doesn't have any spaced armour, nor composite. It's still rolled homogeneous armour. The base of the upper frontal plate is only around 80mm thick, and while the thickest part of the turret is 380mm thick, it is still relatively easy to penetrate for most APFSTS rounds, especially if they shoot at the flattest part of the turret. The lack of advanced armour on this vehicle does make you incredibly vulnerable to both APFSTS or kinetic rounds, as well as heat-of-fast rounds or chemical rounds. So it's fair to say that this tank certainly isn't a brawler or an aggressive pusher. It doesn't have the mobility nor the survivability, but what it does have in abundance is firepower. The tank is armed with a 105mm L7A3 cannon. You can carry 50 rounds in total, with 16 of those rounds being classed as first stage ammunition. Like most NATO-inspired 105mm gun tanks, you have a base reload of 8.7 seconds, which drops down to 6.7 seconds with an ace crew. This is faster than Soviet designs, but still not great. Again, especially if you are up tiered to 9.7 or 10.0. As you'd expect, the gun is fully stabilised in both the horizontal and vertical axis, but a major disappointment is the vertical guidance characteristics. You have 9 degrees of gun elevation, which is pretty bad in by itself, as well as a terrible 6 degrees of gun depression. Now, I know what you might be saying, this tank has a special suspension system, which allows it to depress or elevate. In real life, this was a big advantage for the Japanese, mainly because of the mountainous terrain in Japan, but in War Thunder, this feature is largely a gimmick, and you will barely have time to use it in an actual battle. So while theoretically, you can get a gun depression of 12 degrees if you use a suspension, in game, you will barely have the time to do this, unless you are planning on camping in the same spot for the entire game, which isn't really in the meta. Anyway, the tank also features a laser rangefinder, as well as first generation thermal imaging for the gunner's sight. It does not feature a thermal camera for the commander, but again, for a battle rating 9.0 vehicle, this is to be expected. Anyway, moving on to the ammunition, and because this is a premium vehicle obviously, we don't have a stock grind. meaning you can use whatever ammunition you like. Our base round is the Type 91 HEAT-FS. This travels fairly fast at 1150 meters per second and can penetrate 400mm of armour at all ranges. This is a fairly decent shell, but again, in an up-tier to battle rating 9.7 or 10.0, where most tanks do use some sort of composite armour, it will be largely ineffective against those tanks. We also have the M416 smoke shell. This creates a smoke screen with a radius of 20 meters and will hold for 25 seconds. It's pretty good for blinding enemies and for covering your own advance, but because you have smoke shells on this tank, it isn't particularly important to carry them, at least in my opinion. We then have two types of APFSTS round. The first is the M735. This is a very early APFSTS round, and while it does have pretty good penetration, it lacks post-penetration damage. Arguably, the most important thing about an APFSTS round. Anyway, it travels at 1501 meters per second, at a range of 500 meters, can penetrate 342mm of armour. This is the same round that the XM1 gets access to, and if you've watched the XM1 video, the M735 round is pretty much the biggest weakness of the tank. Luckily for you, however, we get access to the Type 93 round. This is basically a Japanese copy of the DM33. It travels at 1501 meters per second, and at a range of 500 meters, can penetrate 396mm of armour, but more importantly, it has a lot more post-penetration damage. This gives you much better performance in game, as you can reliably one-shot kill tanks by shooting them centre of mass, with the caveat again, if you're in an up tier, you will have to aim for weak spots. But generally, the Type 93 is a fantastic round, and the only premium tank to have better penetration, or a better round than this, is the T72AV Terms, with its 3BM42 Mango round. But, unfortunately for this tank, its great firepower isn't really enough to save it in my opinion. Because so much of the meta at top tier is about mobility, there just isn't really a place for the Type 74G in my opinion. In the old days of War Thunder, where only a few premium vehicles did have thermal imaging, this tank was very powerful. Combining great firepower with thermal imaging, it was a massive advantage on the battlefield. But now pretty much every nation has vehicles with thermal imaging, and with equal firepower mostly, at around a similar battle rating, pretty much negating all of the things that made this tank stand out. And I have to say, ladies and gentlemen, this tank certainly is not worth $60. While it does come in a pack with a few days of premium and some golden eagles, it's still not worth that money. If you do want to buy a premium just for grinding out the Japanese tech tree, then you aren't really in luck, there aren't any good choices at the minute. But if you want a vehicle just to play for Silver Lions, I'd recommend something in the German or the Soviet tech tree. As I said at the introduction of this video, the Japanese tech tree isn't the most in meta at the minute. The best battle rating ranges in my opinion are from 3.0 to around 6.0, so I won't really grind past any of that in my opinion. You can have fun at top tier with the Japanese, they are very fast with good firepower guns, but it is a hell of a grind to get there. But the choice is yours lads, you spend your money how you see fit. Anyway, if you liked the video, please do consider leaving a like and subscribing. If you really liked it, consider becoming a channel member, like Tomato Salad, Doboa LX, Just Someone, Destroy Rating 05, Dr. Bob, Tans, William Tessier, and Lola Alfonso. Thank you very much for becoming members lads, and I'll see you in the next review.